turns journalist, musician, free spirit, Namita Devidayal on an unexpected journey. It is not one she had expected to embark on, but she gradually turns into an accidental pilgrim, discovering ancient texts and universal truths embedded in a religion that she has thus far only nominally belonged to. Struggling with the decision to dissolve a long marriage and finding herself restless and unnerved, it turns out to be just the immersion she needs. Namita is soon neck deep in Upanishads and the Gospels of thinkers like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and her teacher's guru, Dayananda Saraswati. She begins to discover the deep reserves of wisdom that have somehow got drowned out in the cacophony that has consumed and surrounded Hinduism, leading her both to an understanding of the self and to how to unself herself. Candid and open-hearted, this is one woman's journey to discovering peace within herself in a fast, unraveling, and increasingly turbulent world. The book is available for sale after discount for 500 rupees in case you want to grab, not now, after the event, and the author will be happy to sign. Namita Devidayal is the author of The Music Room, Aftertaste, and The Sixth String of Ilayat Khan. Her most recent book is Tangerine, How to Read the Upanishads Without Giving Up Coffee. She is a senior journalist with the Times of India, based in Mumbai, and is a trained classical Indian singer. Namita graduated from Princeton University in the US and over to you.
Thank you, Harish, and welcome, Namita.
Thanks.
I hope you all have had coffee so we can talk about the Upanishads now. And so straight off, what is the reason for that subtitle to the book?
Okay. So I'll explain Tangerine first. So this has happened with all my books that I've just had a whimsical kind of epiphany about the title, and Tangerine really came to me. And also Tangerine has this lovely poppy fizzy vibe, and that's the nature of the book. It's got a certain kind of a very easy quality, and so I wanted it to be a little enigmatic, a little bit when you dig deeper. I talk about how Hinduism is 50 shades of tangerine. And I feel really actually quite saddened by the fact that saffron is a word that has become a bad word for many of us, and it's just kind of tragic. Now the subtitle is where my publishers came in and said that, listen, Tangerine doesn't say anything. If we go to a book distributor or a bookstore, they'll be like, which shelf do we put this in, right? It's not, is it about art? Is it color? What is it? Is it about fruit? And so I was told that we have to somehow bring in something about Hindu or Upanishads or something that explains what the book's about. But that was just making me uncomfortable. I wanted it to have an irreverent quality, something a little more tangential and witty and fun. And so I went to ChatGPT and basically typed in the prompt that asked for all of the above, which would include everything, and I was just shocked because they came up with all these extraordinary ideas, and we love this one because this book is really about how you can sort of layer yourself with a spiritual self and still be as idiotic, materialistic, coffee drinking, other things drinking, and whatever you want. And I love the idea, and I think that many practitioners of this spirituality suggest quite the opposite and kind of confuse people and then turn people away or just become a little bit too self-aggrandizing about this posturing. And I think I was just like, hey, I don't want to change anything about myself except my inner world, and that's what.
So just going back to what you said and what your publishers thought, what part of the bookshelf in a bookstore does this go in? Is it a self-help memoir? Is it inner travel log? Where and what is it meant to be for you as an author?
I think it is all of the above, and I honestly, I like to leave this kind of cubby-holing to the bookstore owner and the distributor and whoever, because I think I spent my whole life consciously not putting myself in a box. I almost sort of trick myself sometimes, and I love the idea that you can be all these different people and it's really about reference to context. And I think we're living in a world that has become so kind of like about putting people into a box and so binary and so polarized that the book has to just, I think that the bookstore owner will project his or her own idea, put it where they want. The reader will come and find their own truth in it, and sort of, that's what I've allowed it to be. I really didn't want to genre it.
You just used the word trick, and that led me to think often, and in Hindu philosophy, and also at the starting of your book, is the reference to the rope and the snake, a visual metaphor, trick, if you might. Would you just like to share with us what that has meant to you in the book?
I think it'll be simplest if I just read out that passage, because it's really something that has moved me, and it's essentially from the Mandukya Upanishad. And it's something that I think we all put into practice with wittingly or unwittingly. You see something in the dark. It seems to be a snake, so you jump with terror. But it's a rope. This story has a real part and an unreal part. There is something. That part is real. It is absolute and irrefutable. The snake is unreal, but only relatively so, because it does bring on fear and make you want to run. Now, when you shine light on this object, the real part, there is, remains unchanged, but the unreal snake changes to a rope. Suddenly, the perception, which was the mind's projection, changes. This is how most of us live, in a state of constant fear of what may not be real. The snake rope paradox is the great mystery of our lives. We cannot say it is there, nor that it is not there. On one level, it is there because we really did jump with terror. On another, it is not, because what made us jump was a mere rope. What we see is, therefore, not the whole truth. The sky is not blue, and the sun does not really set in the ocean. Our thoughts and senses offer only one dimension of experiencing the world. We superimpose our ideas, often from a confused, cluttered, or curdled mind space, turning many ropes into snakes. And when the light shines, we realize that there is no snake. The only absolute truth is, there is, there is, there is.
Thank you for that. In the book, at some point, you say that your journey started with, at some point, a dip in the Ganges. And this whole connection and engagement with water in Hindu philosophy, also as philosophical tirthas or areas and worlds to cross over into. And you also mention, as a journalist, a very interesting story about the Ganga. And I'd be very happy if you could share that with the audience.
So I love the idea of, I've actually always wondered why almost every sacred space will have a water body adjoining it. And it's things that we don't pay attention to, but I think that there's a whole reason behind it. And the more I sort of like studied these ideas, so one of the things that struck me about water is its circularity, which is really a reflection of the whole idea that, this particular form that you're in is just one in a never-ending reel. And so the idea that water, sort of what we learned in our very basic physics class, was that water would move from the river, evaporate into a cloud, and then come down as rain, and then become the river, which then enters the sea. And one of the most powerful metaphors that has really stayed with me about, Advaita philosophy is the idea that, because how do you explain something like Brahman, which is about, the vastness of consciousness? It's really impossible to explain in words. I honestly still don't fully understand it. I'm still like work in progress. So the way my teacher explained something to me has just stayed because it's so kind of like perfect. It's the idea of the ocean and the wave. And the idea that each of us is like a wave which at a particular time has a form and a certain time period when it comes to the beach and then it retreats. But it comes from the ocean and it returns to the ocean. And the ocean contains every wave, past, present, future. And that very idea is so irrefutable and so kind of like beautiful. It's like poetic, but it also makes complete logical sense. So I think that helped me understand the idea of where one fits into this larger consciousness. And the funny story about the water was, so this book is peppered with a lot of anecdotes that are really not very spiritual, because this one involves my editor sending me off to Banaras on a secret mission to find Madonna. And that was my only mandate. I was told, like, we heard a rumor that she's there, so go find her and write a story. And it was a little bit crazy because I was literally roaming around the streets of Banaras asking random people if this blonde rock star was floating around. And then finally found this little Sadhu Baba who had essentially sort of like pretended to be her guru because, and this is how journalism works, by the way. So when Madonna came out with a song which was called Shanti Ashtangi, which was about like, it had a few shlokas in it which she was just dripping on. Some journalist who needed to fill his quota in Banaras, he was with UNI or PTI, I can't remember, went to his friend who was like a semi-sadhu and said, listen to this song, she's used Sanskrit shlokas. And he listened and he said, Sab galat hai, all is wrong. And so, little man, journalist, filed a story, and that story happened to get picked up by BBC Radio, who then decided, because journalism is really increasingly about entertainment, so he decided to call in Madonna and the little semi-sadhu from Banaras and have a little like call between them where they discussed something which she was clearly not very interested in, but like the pronunciation of the shlokas. And eventually the rumor began that she was in Banaras, and that's how it started. So I was there wandering around looking for her, did not find her, but what I did find was something far more special. I was introduced in this whole process to a man called Veerbhadra Mishra, who happened to be the hereditary pujari of the Sankat Mochan temple in Tulsi Ghat. And he also happened to be a hydraulic engineer at Banaras Hindu University. And I think that was the first time that I had sort of seen somebody who was in science and faith talk about the river as if it was literally like a family member. And I remember being really moved by that because the whole idea, he said that we are the earth, and so when you pollute the river, you're polluting yourself. And that sort of ecological idea, which I think faith reinforces, but perhaps doesn't go into the whole sort of pedantic, explanation of, is really beautiful. And it doesn't mean that it's put into practice, because we all know that pollution is an enormous issue, etc. But I love the way he explained that. So that's been my relationship with water, relentlessly. And then of course when I had my first dip into the Ganga in Rishikesh, I think that was the first day of the rest of my life.
So, as we go through the book, there are moments where you talk about things which are incredibly personal, intimate. You talk about your marriage and the fact that you were almost on the edge of a divorce. And these are things, of course, there's a new kind of literary genre where people talk about these things, but I find that not so many Indian authors are comfortable sharing things. And in a book which is about spirituality, why and what was the reason that you felt that you had to share what you have shared?
Because I think when you reach, well, firstly, when you reach 57, you kind of owe it to yourself to be authentic. You know, it's about time. And honestly, I think that, you know, life is tough, relationships are tougher. The interesting thing about my marriage is I'm not like sort of like sitting over there just whining about my marriage and trying, you know, being voyeuristic, etc. It was very purposefully there because what was the saddest moment in my life, which then left me with this kind of lingering melancholy, actually became the inflection point that led me to seek. And so I talk about that because, and of course it's very funny, and I talk about how we, you know, went to get divorced and the judge didn't give us a divorce and all that funny stuff, you know, and we were both laughing about it, etc. Because, by the way, we're still on the verge of divorce, like 20 years later, so it's just an ongoing story.
So you're married but always wanting a divorce?
Well, no, but it's sort of like I'm married, but we live separately, which is just
very healthy,
yeah,
for many of us, yeah.
And so by this point, you know, most of my friends are deeply envious. But to get back to what you're asking me, so there are two reasons that I used the story of my marriage as a narrative thread in this book, which is actually not about either marriage or love or romance, is because my husband actually became the person who led me into this, you know, forest, into this sort of the wild side. And I talked about how I thought he was a little like crazy, and because, you know, I've grown up in Bombay and gone to a school like Cathedral, and then went on to the States, and honestly the idea of like tangerine clad robes and ashrams and all was so far removed from my reality, it's not even funny. And to be honest, I used to be quite snarky about such things because, you know, there was a sense of like, this is just like gobbledygook and irrational, blah blah. Much of it is. And so when he would lead me and my little then my boy who was then a little child into these ashrams like Ramana Maharishis or Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, we'd go along, it would be usually a little offshoot to a holiday that we'd be taking. And so it was a sort of an introduction into these spaces, but I honestly was not able to relate, other than having yummy food on like banana, you know, leaves and things like that in the ashram. I couldn't relate, but I realized, you know, I do believe that there's a certain map of one's life which looking back starts making sense. And I know that this is what has just kept me, you know, drawn to this otherwise difficult man. And so I had to like use that story. And of course, you know, a lot of people I think can relate to a real life story because everyone has had some version of this in their lives, and so it's beautiful to be able to share it without, and there's a fine line, of course. You know, in all my books when I've talked about real people, I've kept it tempered. You cannot sort of go overboard, but I think that it's important to share when there's a larger reason to share. And my larger reason was that I think a couple of things. One is that suffering, if turned right, if navigated, can take you into a much better place. And the other is that everyone is in your life as an instrument towards something, but it's your job to really figure that out. You know? So
when you talk about marriage, I have my own story. One of your main gurus, who is the parampara in which you learned, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, was in Ahmedabad the next day after we were married, 37 years ago. And we are a sort of strange mixture of Gujaratis who are trying to be left and liberal. So my father actually decided that it would be great, because a lot of his relatives from America were going to be able to come in the Christmas holidays, that we should get married on New Year's Eve. And so at every anniversary, wherever you are, you would have a party to go to, which you didn't necessarily have to throw yourself. As a result of which, my wife, Nandi, who's here somewhere, her family went into jitters and was like, oh, but that's not a good day, and how can we do this? And My dad was rather adamant and very gently said, I'm sure you can find a priest who will allow us that. So then Nandi had to have 8 OMAD meals, as we call them now, or 8 Thursdays where she only could have lunch, and then all was good. So we get married on the 31st of December, and Ahmedabad at that time was going through drought, so you couldn't have a big party. So we worked everything around New Year's Eve. The reception had to be over at 9 o'clock so we could all go and have drinks. My grandfather was in the police, and because it was a prohibition state, had to get several licenses and liquor permission so we could have a party. But to cut that story short, the next day we were invited to a friend's house where Swami Dayananda Saraswati was giving a private talk. And so because we were partying, we went late in the morning, and it was full of Malika Sarabhai's mother, Mrinalini Sarabhai, a lot of sort of big mill owners and so on. And this auntie was a friend of my father's, childhood friend, asked, and Swamiji said, okay, now that this young couple is here, I'll talk about marriage, and gave us his perspective, and the rest of the crowd the perspective. But I remember this auntie from the gateway said, but Swamiji, they got married yesterday, and in our Hindu tradition, you're not supposed to marry in this month from 15th of December to 15th of January. And as young kids, we were 23 and 25 when we married. We thought, oh my God, we're doomed, It's not going to go anywhere because it's not a good day. Papa has really got us into trouble. Swamiji turns around with a smile and says, no, this is all rubbish. This is only made sure dates and special events just to make sure that the Brahmins are at work and that they can make a living out of it. The book of Manu says very clearly that when a man or a woman decide to do something, that is the most auspicious time for it. And I thought, that just set us right.
He seems to have been a very liberal man.
Yeah. No, he was wonderful. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to sort of, the marriage and Swami Dayanand led me to that. But you talked a bit about this lingering sadness and then the dip in the Ganges, and then that started you off on this journey of what you call the first day of the rest of your life. But my question to you is, because there are, a mixed audience, young people who are on that journey, what is the right time? How does one know? How does one get to the teacher? How does one find the right source? Because there is so much out there. It's really a buffet of Swamis. Excuse me, hello? Can you switch off your phone, sir?
So I genuinely believe that it's grace. I just don't know when and how that happens, and I feel constantly grateful and blessed that it happened to me at a relatively young age. Having said that, I do feel that, I think there's a time and place for this. Because, and how you have these 4 ashrams, brahmacharya, grahas, vanaprastha and sannyas. They're very broad markers. It's not like they're defined, and they have to be, and especially in our kind of lives today where it's like really, you could be having a child at a much later age, you could go back and be a student as an adult, etc. So I think what they do is they help you just kind of broadly, how you follow a circadian rhythm. So you kind of go through the motions of, being a student and then being a householder. And then vanaprastha, which is sort of, actually it's interesting because Jung talks about this as well, which is that, your life is like a bell curve where, the first half is when you're acquiring wisdom, acquiring knowledge, acquiring money, acquiring fame, acquiring relationships, and then you kind of cross over and it's about slowly letting go, and it's completely logical because if you keep acquiring right until then it's a bit disastrous, right? So you don't leave room. So I think vanaprastha was a metaphor for, entering the forest, but not literally, that the forest is about, 2 things. One is that it's a place of contemplation, which is why a lot of the rishis would head out to the forest. It's also about, it's a place of unknown. And so I think that after one is done with the duties of life is when, and whatever those duties are for different people, it could be, work, it could be family, it could be running a charitable organization, whatever it is. But then I think you need to kind of sort of finish a lot of the stuff, have that experience and maturity. Like my music teacher always said that don't go out and perform when you're too young, because you have to have like really seasoned into the music and into life, and they won't play into each other. So similarly, I think that there has to be that sense of maturity. So I would not be like sitting there and trying to indoctrinate my 24-year-old son with these ideas, because I feel like he does need to now be out there working and earning a living, and those are important things that one has to kind of. So there's a certain, your body, your mind, and everything sort of like, I think logically makes you want to slow down at a certain age and move into the contemplative mind. So I would say that finding the teacher, honestly, I just don't know what to say. And I think in the end you have to realize that you are your real own guru, but you need somebody to guide you, but you have to start trusting an inner voice. And that's been a very interesting exercise for me.
There's a bit where you talk about faith. Shall we read that together, if you don't mind? Because it's a longish read and I don't want to tire you out.
Why don't you start?
Okay. And Namita says, I view faith as that plane beyond the binaries of good and bad, moral and immoral. Just as a blade of grass in the gusty wind, just as a blade of grass in the gusty wind bends but does not break. Relinquishing control can give you strength. The 12-step program started by Alcoholics Anonymous is based on the edifying recognition that you may have very little control over your compulsions. At some point, you surrender to a higher power and ask for help. I remember chatting with a friend of C's, C being her son, who was studying in Canada and was home for the holidays. He was describing a violent snowstorm that had debilitated parts of North America and delayed flights. The flight home was so turbulent that the stewardess spontaneously announced, "Stay calm and pray." The child said, "I remembered every Parsi prayer I had ever been taught and just kept muttering them until we landed."
Although I desisted from blurting an auntie-ish comment, I thought to myself, why wait for bad weather? Pray for a few minutes every day as a kind of pause, just as you would brush your teeth. If you can't think of what to ask for, ask simply to be in alignment with the higher order of the universe. So that year, I had my first dip in the river and my first introduction to a body of knowledge that was different from anything I had ever encountered. I learned that nothing is random. There's a plan in place. You just have to decode the signs, if you choose to. And if you don't, that's also fine, but it might mean getting tossed around in the turbulence some more. I feel humans are like the stones that a river brings down from the mountains. Some stones keep journeying on. They remain rough and get pushed around. Some break down into fertile soil along the banks, nourishing plant and animal life. And some get polished and smoothened over centuries. Then, one day, a passerby might pick up the smooth stone, anoint it with a smear of tangerine, and turn it into her god of small things.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah. The music room was one of your wonderful successes. Tell us about the role of music, why you didn't become a full-time musician, what did it mean going to your teacher Dhondutai at that point of time? Because in some ways when you look back on it, it was also part of what you refer to as the plan, or as we all have our own plans that we see, and you were able to decode it in retrospect. So share some of that with us.
So just as I have not become a sadhu, I didn't become a musician, and I really do believe that when one, we live in a very performative world, and so I think it's kind of a given that if you go and learn music intensely, you're going to go and become a performer of music. But I think, when I wrote the title, The Music Room, it was really, it started out as that physical space, which
And there was no Jack GPT then.
no, there was no chat GPT, but really I know intuitively that the music room is something that is just within me, and it's that place that I turn to, which nobody else can enter, and it's kind of like my little private mehfil, and I think that a lot of these, my music teacher Dhonita was really like my third grandmother, because I spent so much time there as a child, and I'm convinced that, a lot of my thinking has, percolated, her teachings, her way of living, that simplicity has percolated into me, because, I think when you're a child, you just absorb at a very kind of like pure level. And so it was much more than the music. And I know that the music itself, now that I've studied a bit of the sort of Hindu scriptures, I can safely say that the structure and the ideology in the Indian classical music tradition is very much derived from the philosophy that comes from whatever you call it. Now, these are all loaded terms, but Vedic, Hindu, Sanatan philosophy, because well, two or three things. One is that there is a cyclical nature in Indian classical music, so you always come back to a sum. The other is that the intangible note is far more important than the note itself, and the fundamental basis of Hindu philosophy is a belief in the intangible. So things like that, which she would say to me in more prosaic terms, but then throw in something that came from some Upanishad, and all that has definitely influenced me. The other thing is that, the music, all the rags are authorless. I mean, I find that extraordinary, because we live in a world where everything is about being the author of something, and
The self,
it,
the
and
ego, and all of
and
that.
the ego, and this extraordinary tradition which has come down over centuries, and of course been beautifully embellished along the way by the Mughal influences, by court music, etc., is essentially, I mean, nobody owns it. The akar is the most abstract thing, and so I love these ideas because, the Upanishads, nobody knows who's written them. Same thing, right? It's like, it's a revealed wisdom, this idea of like moving beyond the self into something that is a universal wisdom. It really struck me. And of course, my music teacher would treat every note as a deity, and you have to please that deity and all that. So I used to laugh at her, obviously, as a kid, because again, I came to it from a very different space. But it's like now I'm connecting the dots on many levels. I'm joining the pictures sort of like come together, just the way I described that B.N. Goswami picture, where B.N. Goswami, the art historian, once made us look at all these works of art and said, and the title of that particular talk was "The Things You Don't See." And he invited us to pause a little more when we look at art. And he showed us this one painting, which was of a tree with these white flowers that were falling down. And then he said, and now I invite you to pause and look at it a little closer. And the white flowers were the form of Krishna. But it's like you can pass by that painting and just see lovely white flowers falling, or you can see the Krishna. And those are the sort of lovely moments that have happened through my life with my teacher, that Masterji who I write about and talk about. And now I've reached that point where I'm like, yeah, what next? I want something more. I want something. It may have started as a palliative to like take away a little bit of like pain, but I think I'm now just like sort of swimming in that tide, and it's just kind of almost informing everything I do and my relationships and the way I view people. Last week, somebody wrote a really mean review of the book, and I was just like, I read it and I was just like, oh my God, like I was feeling terrible for about 5 minutes, because I said, why should I have control over every single outcome? I don't. And it's okay, that person is probably my former self, which was really snarky and really, looked down on all this Hinduism stuff and whatever. So I was like, okay, whatever's, So it's definitely been a
There's a
journey.
bit about how, when you talk about it, the past, if you don't mind, I'd love to read a bit of it.
Yeah.
This is a bit where she talks about reference to context, and it starts with, and because the past is always present, we are never without a context. We move forward in life using a system of internal navigation informed by our personal and collective histories. Everyone has a backstory that emerges from childhood, even going back to the womb. Further back is the generational debris that calcifies to block many psychological arteries. But we rarely commit to getting an angioplasty of our deeper selves. We continue to behave in irrational ways, stumbling through life, hurting others and ourselves along the way. The Freudian unconscious is a kind of scrap basket of repressed experiences that you can't tolerate, that you don't know how to assimilate. It's a function of what you experience even before you knew you were experiencing, writes Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, who studied the undercurrents in Hindu myths and suggested that the bizarre stories they held touched on those parts that lived well beyond the rational mind. Of late, I've been thinking of the many ways in which the past shapes the self, not only the personal self, but a more intangible, cultural and spiritual self that makes one think and behave in a very particular way. Why I still prefer eating with my hands, how I greet my elders or don't touch a book with my feet, why I might pray to a stone or a tree, why pray at all. It's a recognition of this continuity that drives my quest to connect with those fragments of our collective past that continue to influence us in subtle yet significant ways. It's an exploration that makes me feel more whole somehow. Thank you. You also talk about how all of this is part of our cultural inheritance. And very often with westernization and our need to be more and more modern, we forget it. There's a bit on page actually 48, if you'd read it, would be
But
great.
again, I like not to get into a kind of a binary about West versus East, because, I think we're just many different things, and each one kind of plays into the other, and there are different times and moments when you need, to be perhaps more rational than faith-bound and all those things. So I'm very, very clear. The way I look at life is more layers rather than polarized selves, So I don't know what...
This bit about, I find it charming that we live in 48. Right here.
I find it charming that we live in the midst of a multicultural history rather than boxing things and sending them to a museum. I remember driving through coastal Maharashtra and discovering a 14th century Portuguese fort and church, on the stone walls of which villagers were blithely spreading red chilies to dry. Near the chapel lay stone blocks with Latin engravings, and my friend who lived near there joked that he had often considered casually picking up one of those pieces, but he never did, because he knew that it would be inauspicious. The cultural life of India is geared towards the human being's inner evolution. It is based on the belief that the material and the spiritual are intertwined. I marvel at how an intangible philosophy is braided into our customs and aesthetics so seamlessly. All around us, art, architecture, music have been coded with a network of ideas that you absorb without even knowing it. The lotus that you find in the Pichwai or in Buddhist art is not just pastoral imagery. It is a reminder to live in the mud of the material world and still bloom with transcendence, a detached attachment. In fact, you need the mud for the lotus to blossom. No mud, no lotus. The traditionally constructed temple symbolizes the human form and its aspirations. The outer walls may have friezes depicting explicit sexual positions, but the inside is a quiet, stark space. The shikhara, or steeple, is eternally aspiring to something far beyond. The shrine is deep within the temple, in a place of darkness that lights up only during prayers, when the priest circles a flickering lamp around the altar.
Maybe just go to this last bit.
The purpose of art, architecture, music is to elicit the moment of bliss beyond the vah of praise. The writer Nabokov invokes this idea beautifully in his story, Music, in which a recently divorced couple find themselves in the same concert hall listening to an ethereal piece of music which, for that short time, cocoons them in an invisible dome of togetherness and eases their pain. Music can do that to you every so often, that evanescent feeling, transcending thought, rising above separateness, has been called Anand or bliss, which, the sages say, is our true nature, sheathed by the drama of life. Sat, Chit, Anand. Truth, consciousness, bliss.
To come to more mundane matters, you have this wonderful story about a person who segregates garbage in Alibag and your engagement with him, the Ash and Asha story.
So this, it's funny because you would never think that what we call a bhangar wala or a garbage collector, a recycler would find a place in a book on spirituality, but I really believe that you have to find those glowworm glimmers in the most unlikely places, and that's when you know that you've really imbibed the philosophy and you're not sort of looking in the most obvious places. And so I, during COVID, was spending a lot of time in Alibag, which is a little a rural, it's part of rural. And it was just fascinating to hear how amazingly organized the whole recycling system is in India. And I happened to, at that time, also be studying the idea of our recycled selves in my teacher's class. And so it was just like a very beautiful sort of like parallel in real life where the idea that you become the mud that becomes, that gives rise to the seed, that becomes the tree, that gives you the oxygen that then again nourishes you. It's so beautiful. And so he would speak about all these ideas in a very strange, different way, but it was just a really interesting kind of parallel. And meanwhile, his wife would use really scrappy pieces of cloth that would come in the garbage to make the most beautiful quilts. And so I just loved it, and I used that in my storytelling because, the idea that the seed is the tree is so powerful. And that's the whole point, that everything is in a state of potential, which will then manifest. And that could apply to any one of us. Like, we don't know at what point that trigger which brings something forth. And I love the idea of potentiality. And so I use the story of Ash Mohammed and Aisha Mohammed.
So you're speaking to a Gujarati Banya who sees potentiality in also very real material terms. So what's the role of wealth, money, abundance, resources in the whole world of spirituality?
It's very much a part of it. I mean, I don't see anything in the scriptures that says that you have to abandon all the good stuff. Like Raja Janak is used as the exemplar. He was Sita's father in the Ramayana, and he ran an amazing kingdom, and basically he, to use a metaphor, had rubbed the oil of detachment on himself, so nothing touched him. He had done the Ashtavakra, he had this guru called Ashtavakra, and I love a lot of kind of misconception around the idea of spirituality that seems to suggest that you have to abstain and be a I don't even know what, because I don't get that part. And I happen to have a teacher who, will drink wine when she's out with me, be dressed in a way that doesn't even look like she's got anything spiritual about her. But when she's teaching, she's a teacher. And this idea of separating spirituality from material is really stupid, actually. I mean, it's about layering yourself, right? So if you have material wealth and seek it, so be it, and treat it as abundance instead of something that is like bad or negative, and share it. Use the ideologies within our scriptures to have a better relationship with it, where you're not kind of attached to it or anxiety ridden about it going away, but you're sort of like sharing it with abundance. That's the way I look at it. Because I certainly don't want to like be living in some Spartan way or anything like that. And so, and as I said, this is basically what I've been reading, and I'm marvel at the sort of sophistication of that thought. It's the opposite of polarities, right? And I find polarities have really led us into a very sad space.
You talk about your teacher. What is the best way, or how does one find the right teacher? There are so many teachers out there from...
Right, like whether you talk about music or, adhyatma or whatever. So if a person is only looking for a little soundbite spirituality, they will seek some teacher that fits that bill. I mean, and I'm a bit of a nerd, and I like to go to the source, maybe because I'm a journalist and I've been trained that way, whatever. But I wanted the source texts, and I wanted a teacher to explain them verse by verse without any kind of interpretive gobbledygook coming in. So that was me. But I know a lot of people who go to these so-called franchisee teachers who seem to be getting something from it, and I don't judge it at all. I think you can learn from pretty much anyone once you are open. So it doesn't even have to be somebody sitting who's like being your teacher over there, I mean, some of these teachers are more life coaches than spiritual teachers, but some people need that. Who am I to sit and judge, Honestly, I don't believe in that.
Last story is the Murugan story I want you to share with us.
Oh God.
Because we are in Chennai.
Right. So we were on holiday again, my husband and child and me, we were in Pondicherry, and it was the year of the cyclone. And so we were literally kind of like had to leave because it was just crazy, and it was like the roads were just filled with shards of glass and there were trees lying there. And so, as usual, my husband was like, "Chalo, we're going to go to Tiruvannamalai." And I was just like rolling my eyes and thinking, God, what is this? And there's a 10-year-old kid, and what are we going to do over there? And so we got into a car and started driving, and it was a bit crazy because the driver only spoke Tamil. And on this highway, this scooter comes in the opposite direction, in the wrong side, and sure enough bangs into us, and it's like one full khichdi. And then all these people gather, like, how like ants to sugar to watch tamasha. Nobody speaks a word of English. I could have been in Sicily. And there we were trying to like go ahead. The driver then abandoned us at Murugan Italy house and took off. And it was really scary because it was like 6 in the evening by then, and it was just like no cars, no chance of getting an Uber, blah blah. And then kids had graduated from college and were on their way. And there we were in the car with him reaching the ashram, and it was very nice because in that chapter I remember saying that not all storms are bad.
And on that note, I also love the fact that you ended the last chapter of the book with a shloka that is one of my favorites, but I didn't know it was also Gandhiji's favorite. And I think it'd be lovely if you can finish with that. And after that, we have two wonderful ladies who are going to share a short recitation of the Bhaja Govindam. Namita will be here to sign books and to talk to you all if you have different points of view, if you agree to disagree with her or just want to chat with her. So if you'll be kind enough to share that shloka, and then we'll ask the two ladies to share the Bhaja Govindam with us.
Om Purnamadam Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vadishishyate.
And it means?
It means that we are full, everything that is here is full. If you take away fullness from fullness, fullness remains. And it's basically a way of talking about how we're all essentially deeply interconnected and are all one.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for being here. If we can just have them play the music.